All right, so get this. We're talking about Bashar al-Assad's regime in Syria in power for over 50 years.
Wow.
And then just collapses. Like, poof, gone in 11 days.
It's really unbelievable. I mean, talk about a turn of events.
And the craziest part is you sent us all these sources, news articles, social media posts, even stuff from different countries.
Yeah.
It's like having all these puzzle pieces, but no picture on the box, you know? So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to dive in, figure out how this happened, WHO, these key players are, and maybe even get a sense of what it all means for Syria and the rest of the world.
Sounds good. It's going to be quite a ride, I think.
So 11 days. How does a regime that's been around for half a century just crumble like that?
Yeah.
The sources we have, like these reports from ABC News and Al Jazeera, they lay out the timeline of this rebel offensive.
Right.
And it's almost hard to comprehend how fast it all happened.
You know, what's interesting is it wasn't just speed. It was like this strategically brilliant offensive.
Oh, really?
Yeah. The Guardian talks about how they were using drones and tactics that Assad's forces just weren't ready for at all. It's almost like a David and Goliath kind of thing.
You know what? I see that. It's like they were outsmarting them at every turn. But there's also the morale thing. The Guardian and France 24 both talk about Assad's army just falling apart.
Right.
Soldiers abandoning their posts. Some even fled all the way to Iraq.
Yeah, it's wild.
Why do you think morale was so low? Any guesses?
Well, it seems like years of sanctions really did a number on the Syrian military.
Yeah.
The sources mentioned how they were lacking equipment supplies.
Wow.
And there was probably a lot of internal conflict, too. You know, imagine being a soldier seeing this super determined rebel force coming at you.
Yep.
It's not surprising somebody just gave up.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got these incredibly effective rebels. Assad's forces are crumbling, but who are these rebels?
Right.
We know the group leading the charge is Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, and their leader, Abu Muhammad al-Jalani.
Oh, yeah.
He sounds like a character from a spy movie.
He's a fascinating guy and definitely raises a lot of questions. The AP and Salon articles you sent dig into his past.
Oh, yeah, I saw that.
And it's pretty incredible. We're talking about a former al-Qaeda commander here.
I know. That's what got me, too. This guy was running with al-Qaeda, then he breaks away, rebrands himself as a moderate Islamist.
Right.
And now he's giving interviews to the New York Times and CNN talking about his vision for Syria. It's wild. Is this rebranding legit, or is there something else going on?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's hard to say for sure what his true intentions are. The Salon article mentions some experts think it's a genuine change of heart.
Okay.
Like he realized aligning with al-Qaeda was a mistake. Others are more suspicious. They think it's a tactic to gain power and international support.
So how do we figure that out? What clues can we find in what he says and does to understand his true intentions?
Well, if you look closely at his interviews, especially the one in the New York Times, there are hints of pragmatism.
Like what?
He talks about stability and inclusivity, even working with the international community. But there are red flags, too. His statements about Islamic law are pretty vague, leaving lots of room for interpretation.
Interesting. And what about the big question? What does his rise mean for Syria's future? Especially for minorities. There's a lot of worry out there, right?
Absolutely. The sources, especially some social media posts you sent, really reflect that anxiety.
Yeah.
Al-Jalani says he'll protect minority rights, but his past with al-Qaeda,
Right.
an organization known for intolerance, makes people nervous. It's a wait-and-see situation full of uncertainty and apprehension, for sure.
So we've got this dramatic change inside Syria, but this is a major shakeup globally, too, right?
Totally.
Oh.
This goes way beyond Syria. It's reshaping the whole geopolitical landscape.
It's like a domino effect. Big time. What I find fascinating is how major players like Iran, Russia, Israel, the U.S.,
Yep.
they're all scrambling to figure out their next move.
Oh, yeah.
It's like everyone's waiting to see who makes the first move. Where should we even start with this global power play?
Well, let's start with Iran. They were Assad's biggest ally, and the AP report you sent shows how quickly they pulled out.
Yeah.
Evacuated personnel basically cut their losses. It's a huge blow to their influence in the region.
And knowing Iran, they're not just going to take this lying down, right? What kind of retaliation are we looking at?
That's the big question. Some analysts think they might support proxy groups more,
Okay.
potentially destabilizing neighboring countries.
Mm-hmm.
The Guardian mentioned that. Others think they'll focus on cyber attacks or economic warfare. It's a tough situation to predict what they'll do next.
Then you've got Russia, who, as The Guardian and France 24 point out, are already dealing with the Ukraine situation.
Oh, yeah.
And now they've got Assad, their longtime buddies, showing up asking for asylum.
It's a mess.
How does this impact Putin's strategy, especially with everything else going on?
It's a real dilemma for him. Granting Assad asylum was a calculated risk.
How so?
On one hand, it makes him look bad internationally, like he's supporting a dictator.
Right.
But on the other hand, it lets him keep a foothold in the Middle East.
Oh, I see.
He could use Assad's knowledge and connections for future moves.
So it's a power play, but a risky one. It makes you wonder what his long-term plan is. And speaking of power plays, we've got Israel making moves in the Golan Heights, according to the New York Times, and Haaretz.
Interesting.
Netanyahu's practically saying they orchestrated Assad's downfall. Think he's exaggerating, or did Israel really play that bigger role?
Well, Netanyahu's known for his, let's just say, creative way with words, while Israel definitely has interests in Syria,
Like what?
mainly stopping Iranian-backed forces near their border. It's unlikely they were the main reason Assad fell.
So they're more taking advantage of the situation, protecting their own interests? Makes sense. What about the U.S.? They've been pretty quiet through all this. What's Biden's plan?
CNBC and Axios say Biden's being cautious, which is surprising given all the moving parts.
Yeah.
He supports a democratic transition in Syria, but doesn't want to get too involved, especially with Ukraine still going on.
Makes sense.
But Al Jazeera mentions increased U.S. military activity in the region, airstrikes against ISIS, mostly.
Right, because even though Assad's gone, ISIS hasn't magically disappeared. It's a good reminder that this is far from over. And there are still lots of dangerous groups out there.
Exactly. The fall of Assad created a power vacuum, and it's unclear who will fill it. It's volatile with potential for more conflict and instability.
And it's not just about these major players either. We're talking about reactions from all over the world. France 24 highlights the celebrations in some countries, while The Guardian points out this anxiety in others.
Yeah.
It's like the whole world is holding its breath, waiting to see what happens next. But at the end of the day, this isn't just about politics and global power. It's about the Syrian people, their lives, their hopes, their fears.
Absolutely.
What are the sources saying about how they're experiencing this massive change?
That's a really important point. It's easy to get caught up in all the political stuff,
Yeah.
but we can't forget about the real people at the heart of this.
Yeah.
And the sources you've gathered really capture their experiences. On one hand, there's this huge sense of relief, even joy in some parts of Syria. The South China Morning Post has pictures of people celebrating in Damascus, tearing down posters of Assad. Wow. Just this outpouring of emotion after decades of oppression.
It's like they can finally breathe again after years of struggling and suffering.
Exactly. Al Jazeera even has a report about celebratory gunfire in Homs,
Wow.
a city completely devastated by the war. And now there's this feeling of hope, of new beginnings.
It's incredible to see that kind of resilience, finding hope after so much destruction.
It is. But we also have to acknowledge that this is just the start of a long and difficult journey. The sources, especially The Guardian and Al Jazeera, are clear about the challenges ahead for Syria.
Yeah.
We're talking about a country ravaged by war. Infrastructure is destroyed. Economies in ruins. Millions of people displaced, living in terrible conditions.
It's hard to imagine the scale of rebuilding that needs to happen. And then there's the millions of Syrian refugees around the world.
Right.
Will they be able to come back? Will they even want to after all that's happened?
It's a tough question.
The Guardian had stories about families separated for years,
Yeah.
living in limbo, not knowing what the future holds.
It's a complex issue with no easy answers. Some refugees are desperate to return and rebuild their lives,
Okay.
while others are hesitant, traumatized, unsure if they can truly go home. And even for those who do return, the challenges are huge.
Yeah.
Rebuilding homes, restarting businesses, reintegrating into a society that's been completely changed by war.
It's a lot.
It is.
And all this is happening while there's this huge power vacuum. Assad's gone, but who takes his place?
Right.
We've talked about al-Jawlani and HTS, but the sources, particularly Al Jazeera and The Guardian, say it's not that simple.
Right.
There are other rebel groups, each with their own goals vying for power. Then you've got the Kurdish-led forces in the northeast and the Turkish-backed groups in the north.
It's a recipe for disaster.
It feels like it. And then there's the international community. What role do they play in all this?
Al Jazeera says the UN wants a peaceful political transition,
Okay.
but it's unclear how that'll actually work. We've got Turkey pushing for inclusivity, Russia trying to hold on to its military bases, Israel asserting itself in the Golan Heights. It's a high-stakes game, and the Syrian people are stuck in the middle.
It's almost too much to think about all these different forces, all these competing interests. But in the midst of all this political maneuvering, there's one thing that I found really haunting.
What's that?
The stories of the people who were imprisoned by Assad's regime. Al Jazeera has interviews with former prisoners who are just released.
Right.
And their accounts of what they went through are just horrifying.
It's awful.
We're talking about torture abuse, a level of cruelty that's hard to even imagine.
It's a stark reminder of how brutal Assad's rule really was.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just isolated incidents, it was systematic.
Oh, wow.
A deliberate strategy to silence dissent and control people through fear.
It's scary to think about.
When you read these accounts, you get a sense of the deep traumas so many Syrians have experienced. These scars will take generations to heal.
It makes you wonder about justice and accountability.
That's
Now that Assad's gone, will anyone try to hold him and his regime responsible for these crimes? Will the international community demand justice for the victims?
It's a complicated issue, full of legal and political challenges.
It is. But I think it's something we as a global community need to face.
I agree.
Ignoring these atrocities would send a terrible message.
Absolutely.
It would say that those in power can do whatever they want without consequences, that human rights don't matter.
It's a dangerous precedent to set.
It's a heavy thought. But even as we acknowledge the darkness of the past, we have to hold on to that hope we saw earlier. The hope in the faces of the Syrian people celebrating their freedom from tyranny.
Definitely.
Their resilience, their determination. That's what gives me hope for Syria's future.
I agree. In the end, it's the Syrian people who will decide their own fate.
Yeah.
The international community can help, but it's their courage, their spirit, that will shape their country's future.
As you continue to explore these sources, I encourage you to pay attention to the voices that are often silenced, to really dig into the nuances of this situation, and to come to your own conclusions about what this transition means for Syria, for the region, and for the world.
Well said.
It's a story that's still unfolding, and your understanding, your engagement is crucial to shaping a more informed and compassionate response.
It really is.
Yeah.
The situation in Syria reminds us that even when things seem incredibly difficult, human resilience and the pursuit of a better future can prevail. So keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep looking for ways to make a difference.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Of course. Thanks for having me.